We're going to dive pretty much right into our second session here. In our first week, so last Friday, we talked a little bit broad strokes. We talked about some of the developments over time with Hebrew. I did get a couple of questions on that, so that throughout today, I'm going to answer those. Also, because a lot of the answers are, to one specific question, will reinforce some of the other things that we've done. So I'm going to share some slides here. And essentially, this is going to be a quick review, and then we're going to dive right in. So, last week we talked about how understanding the nature of Hebrew and the development of Hebrew is really helpful in understanding its rules. So Hebrew is not arbitrary, especially when you get into older versions of Hebrew, like biblical Hebrew. It's really useful to understand that people spoke this language and then writing was developed. And one of the reasons that is useful is, especially when it comes to spelling and things like that, people get really tripped up because multiple symbols make the same sound today, right? So a classic example of that in the Ashkenazic community is the chet and the chaf. Today they make the same sound. And so if you were to take a spelling test where a person just says a word out loud, let's take the word chacham, right? You take the word chacham, you've got two identical sounding ch letters and then a mem, right? And so it's really difficult to know which are they both chets? Are they both chafs? Are they, how does that work? And so one of the things that's really useful to understand is that the word chacham didn't originally sound like that, right? So the chet, the first letter in the word chacham, which means wise or smart, that first letter was much more of an open guttural, and it was like a het as opposed to a chaf, which is a little bit further up in your mouth. And we're going to play with sounds together in a little bit. You'll be able to feel the difference in some of those. So that's something that's useful. We're also, in a bit, going to talk about why the word chacham cannot start with a chaf. So for those of you who are maybe new to the Hebrew alphabet, the kaf and the chaf are the same letter. It kind of looks like a C. One has a dot in it, one does not. One makes a hard sound and one makes a soft sound. And so we're going to talk in a bit why the word chacham, even when they sound exactly the same nowadays to an Ashkenazi speaker, we know that the first letter cannot be the chaf. It would have to be the kaf. So we'll talk about that. And then the other things that we talked about is that, Hebrew has always had different accents, different dialects coexisting. And so for anyone who says, that you have a weird accent or whatever, it would be weird if you didn't. Everyone has an accent. There's no way not to have an accent. And often our accents really are tied into our identities. And so I actually do think that when people make fun of, let's say, an American, or I feel bad now. In high school, I made fun of a friend of mine who spoke Hebrew with a very thick Russian accent. I should not have done that, right? When you're criticizing someone's accent, I really think you're also criticizing a piece of their identity, and that's something to be aware of. And so there have always been accents. The one thing that I'll say about pronunciation here that I think is important is that the consistency of your pronunciation is important. So that's the thing. If you're always making if you recognize that certain letters make certain sounds in your accent, then the consistency of that is important. And so that's where a lot of people get kind of tripped up with those letters that kind of sound the same or have a variation, is that they're kind of picking and choosing and doing it wrong. So we'll talk about that too. And then just the last core concept is that the Hebrew language is alive and it always evolves, even today. So we talked a little bit about ancient writings and ancient scripts, but I didn't actually have visuals that I could show you. So I want to show you a few of these examples of a Paleo-Hebrew script, of an older Hebrew script. So this inscription, and I'll pause here also just to say that a few of the examples that I'm going to show you are maybe what you would call biblical Hebrew, but these aren't biblical writings. Okay, so these are non-biblical writings. This is called the Siloam inscription in Silwan. It's Hezekiah's tunnel, which some of you might have gone to if you've gone to Israel. You've walked through that tunnel. For some people, it's way too short, and they bump their heads. I've never had that problem, but this is an inscription on this tunnel, and I'll show you what. This, by the way, is no longer the original. Has been cut out and is now not there. It's in a museum, but this is a copy of that. And you'll see that the Hebrew, the modern Hebrew script, right, which some people call Aramaic script or, modern Hebrew script, has been written below that. And this is not translating, it's just transcribing an old script to a new script. And you can recognize it. So if you remember, if you were on last week, we talked about how the Greeks took that Phoenician alphabet, which was exactly the same as Paleo-Hebrew, which you see here in the inscription. And as they switched from writing from right to left and they went left to right, they rotated these symbols, and that letters in Hebrew, like we called them the Ahoy letters, the Aleph, the Hey, the Vav, and the Yud, the Ahoy letters, these were not so useful. They're very soft, gentle sounds, and so they weren't useful to the Greeks, and so they turned them into vowels. So you'll notice this first, again, Hebrew going right to left, this first letter here kind of looks like a mirror image of an E, right? That's a Hey. If you look at the bottom here, the first letter that you see is a Hey, right? So this is exactly what that is. It's this Paleo-Hebrew script that has been just rewritten in modern Hebrew language or in modern Hebrew fonts so that you can read it. This inscription basically just talks about the process by which they built this tunnel with people digging from two different sides. So this comes from around 700 BCE, before the Common Era. Another one, and this is a quote that is, or a very similar quote to one that's in the Bible, is there are these silver scrolls that were found in a place called Ketef Hinnom, and these appear to have almost exactly the priestly blessing that we have in the Bible today. So if you look, right, like kind of at this line here, I don't know if you can see my cursor here, but it says like Sheyivarechecha Adonai v'yishmerecha, right? That God should bless you and keep you. Ya'er Adonai panav elecha, right? It's the parentheses that you see in the Hebrew here in this kind of middle column are basically a piece of the inscription that's missing or been corrupted because these silver scrolls haven't been perfectly preserved. But you can see that this is essentially the priestly blessing that we have today. And then another one that I want to show you, and these are cool. So one of the things that some people say is they'll say, Yoni, like this is such an old language, like how could we possibly learn new things about such an old language? Well, archaeology really helps us, and also imaging really helps us. So there are this finding in the 1940s from Qumran, just outside of the Dead Sea. We found I wasn't there, I wasn't even alive, but we found these jars that perfectly preserved these biblical writings, these scrolls, and some writings that were not canonized in the Hebrew Bible, but you've got kind of religious writings. And this scroll here is kind of a big deal for a lot of people because this is actually the entire book of Isaiah in the same order that we have it today. So the Dead Sea Scrolls, they have writings that are not in the Hebrew Bible. They have variations of texts that we have, things in different orders. The Isaiah scroll here actually does have a different spelling of a lot of things than we have today, but this is essentially the entire book of Isaiah found, and this was written around 125 BCE. So I want to zoom in and show you how cool this is. So this is really like the Aramaic font. This is a font that you can sort of see looks similar to the Hebrew that you are used to today. And I just want to bring you to the last line, the bottom line here. And you see, this is the beginning of Isaiah 40, right? So the Shabbat after Tisha B'Av, when we read the book of Lamentations, we're lamenting the destruction of the temple. We read from the book of Isaiah, it's called Shabbat Nachamu, because the chapter 40 of Isaiah starts Nachamu, Nachamu Ami, right? It starts, comfort, comfort my people. And you can see it. It's a little bit faded, but I mean, the fact that this has survived thousands of years and have been intact like this shows how good of a job they did in preserving these in jars, and also the climate of the Dead Sea, kind of that very dry climate, was helpful in recovering these. Another thing that we're still recovering is new imaging technologies makes it easier for us to continue to learn from the Dead Sea Scroll collections. So you have, it's basically word for word Isaiah 40, which is pretty cool. Isaiah 40 is also sometimes called Second Isaiah, and that's the book of Isaiah has a few authors in it, at least two, probably three, and the second author comes in Isaiah 40. Now, here's a quote that I also just think is just so cool, and so I had to put it in here, which is something that the English translation you'll probably recognize. But if you see, I tried to highlight it as best I could. That we have here, you see it says, now there are no vowels in here, which we'll talk about in a second. There are no vowels, but you see it says, kol gei naseh v'kol har v'giv'ah, right? You've got this, every valley will be uplifted and every mountain shall be lowered, right? And the quote that I have on the right comes from Dr. King's famous I Have a Dream speech, where he pulls from Second Isaiah. Second Isaiah is which starts in Isaiah chapter 40, is known for being this post, kind of this this exilic, so he's in exile and he's writing about this future world that's going to be like a messianic age, or a beautiful new world that's going to come. And so it made sense for Dr. King to pull from that at the end of his I Have a Dream speech when he's talking about a brighter future. So here, but you have essentially letter for letter, word for word, this ancient recording of the book of Isaiah. So I think that's cool that we still have that. Now, we're in a fast forward about 1,000 years, and we get to these codices. A codex is basically just a fancy word for a book. And really, these manuscripts are kind of the best version, the most clean and precise version of the text of the Bible that we have today that have ever been found, right? So these are the oldest, most complete manuscripts. Now, some people say, right, they say, well, the Bible, however many thousands years old you want to say, and whatever, the oldest version of the Bible with the exact spelling and everything included that we have today is a little bit more modern than one might think, right? So this is from around 1,000. So here we have, this is called...
I'm sorry.
No,
are those cantillation marks at the bottom?
Yeah. So this is really cool. So let's talk about the Tiberian Masoretes for just a second. The Masoretes are basically it's a title that we give to a bunch of different schools of scribes that existed in different parts in the ancient world, or not really so ancient, but in the medieval world. And they were scribes that tried to preserve the tradition. So the word Mesorah means tradition. They were trying to preserve the scribal tradition of the Bible. And they meticulously tried to copy everything down. They would correct mistakes from previous manuscripts and compare them to other ones. You had more accurate scribes. So you had scribes who were just known for being really good for their work. And so these codices, the Aleppo Codex, and the next one I'll show you is the Leningrad Codex. These are known from the Ben Asher family. This was a family, I think last week I mentioned they were like really, really useful people in over the course of history, but probably weren't fun at a dinner party. These people were meticulous in the way that they copied down the text. Now, the text that we have today, we call it the Masoretic text. The text, if you were to open up a Torah scroll today, you would see the text that the Tiberian Masoretes perfected, essentially. But there are variations of this. So the Dead Sea Scrolls show a lot of variation in the text, and not just little things like spelling, like totally different words in really meaningful places. When you look at old translations of what was originally a Hebrew text. So we talk about the Septuagint, which is the Greek, a famous Greek translation of the Bible, the Vulgate, which is a Latin translation of the Bible. When you look at these other versions, ancient versions, far more ancient than the Aleppo Codex, you see there are a lot of variations in the biblical text. So, we say today, right, a traditional Jewish person is raised generally with the idea that the Torah scroll that you have today, this Masoretic text, was like the perfect text from Moses, and it's never been changed and it can't be changed and all of that. And okay, so there's like an emotional truth to that, but historically, this is a relatively new text. Now, the Masoretes did a whole number of things. So if we look back, let's see if I can successfully scroll backward. Yes. If you look back at older versions of the text, you'll notice there are no dots or dashes, there are no vowels, there are no cantillation marks, there's nothing, right? This was a new invention of the Masoretes. They basically said, look, we're losing how these words are supposed to be pronounced, right? Like through persecution and, just over the course of history, this is no longer a spoken language. It's just a written one. We're really losing it. So they came up with vocalization marks to help readers pronounce things properly. Now, what's funny, and we talked about this a little bit last week, is that they themselves had lost a lot of the original tradition, right? Because 1,000 years had passed since this had been a spoken language, or 800, 900 years had passed. And so, you pick up different sounds and different conventions of other languages that you're in. But what they did was they said, from what we have today, we're going to write down a system of markings. And by the way, the Tiberian marking system is not the only one that exists. So there's a Babylonian vocalization system, there's a Samaritan system, there's a Israeli, or, depending on what year the literature was written, it might be called the Palestinian system. So you've got all of these different systems of vocalization marks. What's also funny or ironic about the Tiberian system, which is the system that we have today, all of these vowel signs that you see here under the words or under the letters, those are the vowels that we use in modern Hebrew. When you look above and below, when you see these cantillation marks or tamim or trope marks, these are the ones that we use. What's ironic is that we now don't use their markings to make the sounds that they were making, right? So we still use their vowel sounds, but we've changed the way that these vowels actually sound nowadays. And the musicality of the trope marks, of the cantillation marks, the ta'amim, the musicality of that is totally lost and has been, different cantors over history have written, different Jewish musicians have written different melodies for those. So this here on the left is just like what a full page looks like. What I think is really useful about noticing this is, and I know it's really small, I'm sorry, in the margins, you have all of these markings. These margins are scribal notes. So they'll say, there's a typo here, right? They'll say, we have to copy this down letter by letter exactly as we have it from previous manuscripts. It's the only way you preserve a text perfectly, is by not taking any scribal judgments at this point in Jewish history. But they would write in the margins, there's a mistake here, right? And so they would write scribal notes on that. They would write other notes and say, here's a weird spelling. This is the only time it's spelled this way. I just find that interesting, right? They might make notes on spacing and lines. And this system of a codex, of a manuscript that looks like this, is almost certainly influenced by the great Arabic writers of the time. And so here on the left, this looks like Ha'azinu. So this is from the book of Deuteronomy on the left, the end of Deuteronomy. And this text that you see on the left here with kind of the two columns is a very, very old piece of the Bible. This is a poem ascribed to Moses, and it's one of the few things that has been dated as much earlier than the majority of the biblical text. So it's actually, when we talk about how sensical Hebrew is, a lot of the exceptions to the rules appear in this poem, in the Song of the Sea, which we're reading this Shabbat. These really, really ancient poetic pieces of literature, they show that Hebrew developed over time. And then on the right here, you just have the beginning of Joshua, which starts with, after the death of Moses, etc. And then real quick, this is the Tiberian system also wrote another codex. It's called the Leningrad Codex. By the way, just in case I didn't make this clear, both of these codices were written in Tiberias, right? When it's called the Aleppo Codex, it's because the Syrian Jewish community in Aleppo held on to this, the Leningrad Codex, because that's the museum that it's in. But they were all written in Israel around the Sea of Galilee and Tiberias. And here you just see another, you can tell, like, it's so clear. The writing is so clear. The lettering is so clear. The vowels are so clear. The accent marks, everything is just, it's a work of art and science. It's brilliant. But it's also worth noting that these are the people who invented these dots and dashes and vowel signs and things like that. Okay, so just real quick, kind of finishing our summation here, we talked about how the alphabet developed over time. I'll also note here that the order of the alphabet has also developed over time. So, I mentioned how there were archaeological findings of the Siloam, of the Hezekiah's tunnel inscription. There were the silver scrolls. There were all of these different non-biblical texts that were preserved in pottery and potsherds. Like in Lachish, you have basically generals were sending each other reports, like military reports that are preserved in potsherds. But you also have something, I forget exactly how it's pronounced. I think it's pronounced like an abecediary, whatever, some fancy word that means. We found recordings of people practicing the alphabet. So it could have been a school or a synagogue or whatever, practicing the alphabet. And we noticed that the Hebrew alphabet has varied in order over time. This becomes really clear biblically when you read Lamentations, when you read Echa. It's all of these acrostic poems, and some of them flip some of the letters. And now there's brilliant, traditions of rabbinical explanation for the beauty of why, like the ayin and the pei or whatever are flipped, and there's something to that. It's also worth noting that at different times in history, the alphabet, its order itself was actually still changing. We talked last week about how there were originally only these Sophite letters, these final letters. The descender was becoming a little bit much, and so they kind of bent the tail over, and then you got what we would consider normal letters that appear anywhere in the word. I mentioned though that the mem is different, right? The mem Sophite doesn't have a descender, and it's a little bit odd and a little different. And it appears that at some point in Hebrew's history, these two versions of the mem were actually used interchangeably at any point in the word. And we do still have biblical texts that show this. So here, this Isaiah chapter 9, verse 6, and you can look at it, is the actual text in the Torah has a mem sophit, a final mem in the middle of the word. Now, the reason that this has no vowels on it is because that's actually the text that's written in the Torah scroll, but in a manuscript in brackets, which got screwed up here because I was typing in Hebrew and English on the same line, but in brackets you'll have, it's called Keri Ketiv. One version is written, Ketiv, one version is written in the Torah scroll, but another one is what you actually say. And so that's another thing that's mentioned in the margins of those ancient manuscripts, is that they'll say, okay, this really should be a regular mem, not a final mem. And there are a couple of other examples of that too. This last one here is a little controversial, so I'm not going to go totally into it, but the line was definitely messed up here. So this mem, because it's not a mem sophit, it was put at the beginning of the word. It actually should have been at the end of the previous word. The spacing of the letters got messed up, and it's possible that that mistake was made because the scribes were interchanging the different versions of the mem. So now we get to this piece here. We're going to start making funny sounds. Fancy words, plosives, fricatives, basically all it means is you've got these hard sounds where the sound is stopping, and then you have open sound where it opens up and air is passing through. So we talked about these. This is used in a kind of a mnemonic device, beged kefet. That's a nonsensical word. It's literally just putting all of the letters next to each other so that you can remember them as if it means something. And so beged kefet, it's the bet, gimel, dalid, the kaf, the pei, and the tav. So this is where I mentioned before how we know that the word chacham cannot be pronounced, or I'm sorry, it cannot be spelled with a chaf. That would be the fricative, right? Without the dagesh in it, without the dot in it, because in modern Hebrew, a word can only begin with that hard sound. So I'm going to show you some examples of that, but it's just something to note that even in biblical Hebrew, first of all, there were originally only these hard sounds, but as they appeared in different parts of words, those sounds became difficult to make, and so they opened up. And so you can notice if you play with, the articulation in your mouth, you can notice how the B and the V sound are both happening at the front of your mouth, at your lips. And then we can move backwards and you get the kaf and the chaf. And those are both happening in the back of the throat. The difference is that with the chaf and the vet, right, air is flowing through. So here's a question for you, right? Is the word falafel, right? Falafel, the deep fried chickpeas. Is the word falafel a Hebrew word originally?
No.
Okay,
No,
Michael, why not?
You can't start any Hebrew word with that fe or f sound.
Exactly, right? So this is a loan word from Arabic, right? So you know that this word, right? Everyone says falafel with a fe, right? That can't happen in Hebrew. Now, I will say, and we'll talk about this maybe next week, but like it can happen in biblical Hebrew, but only if the word that preceded it had an open syllable. So almost as if the two words were connected. But in modern Hebrew, the simplification of that rule is just you get a hard sound, you get a plosive at the beginning of the word. Yeah, Fern.
I have a question. In most languages, and Hebrew, I'm sure, is one, import words from other languages. So besides falafel, are there other technical words, cell phone, et cetera, that would start with these taboo sounds?
Oh yeah. So one of the things that I think is worth noting is that Hebrew has always brought loan words into the language. The difference between biblical Hebrew and modern Hebrew is that biblical Hebrew was pulling from very, very similar languages, right? The world was kind of smaller at that time. These alphabets and the writing systems developed kind of together. And so a lot of the loan words into biblical Hebrew are still pretty similar to what we've got, and you can kind of figure it out. The thing that's very difficult nowadays is that Hebrew now has English words in it, and German words in it, and Russian words in it, and Arabic words in it, and just like all of it. So yes, you do have a lot of words that don't work, and that also we're going to talk in a bit. We're going to talk about roots, this 3-letter roots, which is the foundational essence of a Hebrew word. When you bring in a word like banana, which in Hebrew is banana, it doesn't have a Hebrew root to it, right? So it's very, very difficult. Now we try to like Hebrewize it. So like 2 bananas would be bananot, right? We like throw the Hebrew suffix for a plural on there, but yes. So that is something that for me, biblical Hebrew seems to make way more sense to me than modern Hebrew, because modern Hebrew is just like got everything in it. So this was a question that Marilyn emailed me that I really think is worth noting, because 1, it is an important correction to what I said last week, and 2, it also expresses this concept really well. So last week I said, that people stopped speaking Hebrew around 70 CE, the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem, and that's ish true, right? So we don't know exactly when Hebrew stopped as a spoken language, but we know that around the Roman period, Hebrew stopped being spoken as a regular language. And one of the reasons for that is that the Romans were exceptionally committed to destroying everything that wasn't Roman. And so they were an incredibly gruesome regime. And so they really, like, it's not a surprise that exile lasted for 2,000 years, right? Whereas with the Babylonians, it only lasted a few hundred years, and the Persians quickly conquered the Babylonians and then sent us back and all that kind of stuff. The Romans were really problematic. And so they really did stop the speaking of Hebrew as a regular language. It was really only preserved in writing and through liturgy. Now, the Bar Kokhba revolt is really probably closer to when Hebrew stopped being spoken. The Bar Kokhba revolt around 135 was kind of a last-ditch effort to defeat the Roman Empire, to expel the Roman Empire from the land of Israel. And that was very, very horrifyingly shut down, right? So that was quashed exceptionally gruesomely by the Romans. So one of the examples of a story, which I actually don't read often because I have a weak stomach, but one of the things that the Romans did, they rounded up these ancient rabbis and they tortured and executed them in terribly, horribly creative ways. And so I don't talk about it because I don't like thinking about it, but for here, I'll do it for us. So Rabbi Akiva, there's a famous story of his dying words, which is that as they're executing him, he calls out the Shema. And as he, and the story says that in his dying breath, he elongates the Daled in the word Echad, the last word of the Shema, that he elongates that word, and that his dying breath is once that he held on to that note as long as he could. And once the Dalet was done, he died, right? Now, the question that a lot of people have is, how do you elongate a D sound, right? How do you elongate a stop, right? And so the answer to this, right? Who can give, we've kind of talked, we've laid the groundwork. So who can tell us why this is possible? How do you, I kind of tricked you in the question. It's not so much that he's elongating a D sound, it's that he's elongating the Dalet. How do you elongate the Dalet at the end of a word like this?
You'd have to add a vowel to keep it going.
Right, it would have to turn into like duh or something, right? Duh, right? But that's not, there's no vowel there. So I'm going to scroll back up. Okay, how do you elongate the Dalet?
Turn it into a fricative.
Yeah, so there's no dot in that Dalet, right? It's at the end of the syllable. It's not starting the word or starting a syllable or anything like that. And so that was actually the Val, right? Which is still preserved in Arabic, by the way. It's useful to know that other Semitic languages still have that sound. It's like a soft TH. So the D, right? Your tongue is just behind your front teeth in a D. And so if you turn it into a fricative, it turns into a soft the, right? So like this. Okay, so that sound, that word was actually ehad. That was that word. And so he elongates that Dalet, which is only possible by recognizing that the Dalet is one of these, like the bet and the vet, that has this open, softer, longer form to it. Now, in today's world, we've lost this, right? So especially in most communities across the world, Hebrew has lost this sound. And so you'll often hear people emphasize the D, right? So they'll say like Shema, right? And they'll get Ana Echad, right? They'll like really give it a D, and it's like a very aspirated D. That's our modern attempt at honoring this lengthening of that sound. But really the way that was done was that it was a fricative, and we just don't have that anymore. So I think that's a good one. Okay, so we've spent half of our time reviewing last week, but that's okay. Review is the way we learn. And so now let's just play with some sounds. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about like phonology and articulation. And here is where we get to have some fun. So let's do these three going left to right. Let's just do these three sounds. And what I want you to focus on is where in your mouth these sounds are coming from. So where the contact points are. Okay, so we're going to start with the P or the P, right? So that's right up here in the front, right, with your lips. Then we have the T, right, the T. Your tongue is up on your palate, basically behind the teeth, and you have the K, right? You're in the back of the throat, so you're moving backwards. PTK, right? You're moving backwards into toward your throat. And so this, and there's a lot on this page, so I'm going to be careful here. But the Hebrew sounds fit across this articulation matrix that stems from your vocal cords into your mouth. Your nose is also used, so nasal sounds like an N or an M are nasal sounds, whereas like an S is not. And so here you notice, right, we have all these fancy words for it, but you've got, the bilabial because you're using both of your lips with a B sound, labiodental because it's your P, you've got the F sound. So F, my top teeth are touching my bottom lips, right? So labiodental, the lip and the teeth. You have the T or the Th, where you're right on the teeth. The T, as opposed to the soft TH, Th, is a little bit further back. Your tongue is a little further back, whereas with like a Th, like thank you, you're kind of splitting the teeth in that sense, right? So you've got all of these different, and you work your way back to like a very, very back of the throat, very open, that hey sound, that H sound, huh, right? Now, here's where I like to give you a rule. So one of the questions that I get a lot is, Yoni, why sometimes? So when we talk about roots and things, we're going to talk about prefixes. And most Hebrew students know that the prefix for and, right, the way that you say and, is a vav, right? You say vi, right? So, and I walked, vi halachti, right? You throw the vi on there. But sometimes we have an u instead of a vi. So it's still a vav, but there's an u instead of a vi. And people always ask me, how do you know when it's an u and when it's a vi? So there are really two rules. The next rule I'll give you next week. But for this one, we call it the bump rule. The reason it's the bump rule, it's these bilabials, the b, m, and p. Okay, b, m, p, bump. When the vav precedes a bet, a mem, or a pei, it turns into an u. And the reason for this, it's not arbitrary. It's just because it's easier, right? So this language was spoken first and written later. It's just easier to make this sound. It's much harder to make a vim than an ume. It's much more difficult to do vip than oop, right? It's just because the v is already up there, right? It's a fricative sound that's in the front. It's hard to switch then over to a hard bilabial. And so it's easier to have like a rounding vowel, It's just an easier thing for your mouth to do. And so we see I have, 3 different examples here, and you'll see that there are throughout, you'll see like, I'm just picking out this word here, right? We have v'ra'a, but here we have ufasach, right? And it's there, again, just because the vav is preceding a bump letter, right? It's one of these bilabials, or when it turns into a fricative, a labiodental. And it's just because this is a hard sound to make. And so the vi prefix turns into an u. And so for people who are reading Torah, and this is, I'm just going to pull this off of the share just for a second. When people read Torah and they don't see the vowels, it's really, really hard, right? It's really, really hard to read Hebrew without the vowels, unless you're a native speaker. And especially because biblical Hebrew is different from modern Hebrew, it's even harder for a person, even if you are fluent in Hebrew, it's hard to read biblical Hebrew properly. And so what do we usually do? Right? I've done bar and bat mitzvah tutoring reluctantly for the past 7 years, right? What do we usually do? We say, oh, memorize it, right? Here, I'm going to sing the whole thing for you, and then you're going to go home, and you're not going to know what the words mean, and you're not going to get how it works, but you're just going to memorize it, right? If you even took a Hebrew class with a teacher who doesn't know, and you say, why sometimes is it a v and other times it's an u, what does the teacher say? It's just the way it is, deal with it, right? Memorize it, learn it. The thing that I find really useful, and this helps me when I read Torah, especially if I don't have a lot of prep time, is I can notice, I just know it, right? If I see that there's a vav, that's going to mean and it's before one of these bet, mem, pay letters, I know it's an u. I don't even need to practice it, right? I just know that that's the case, and it will always be the case, right? So that's one of the reasons that I think understanding the why behind this, understanding the development of the language is so useful, is because this system isn't arbitrary. You don't, in biblical Hebrew, have a lot of exceptions to these rules. And so it's really, really useful to understand the system there. So just a couple of little fun things. I just like doing the voiced and the unvoiced. Everyone make an S sound. Okay, now make a Z sound, right? And now you notice that the articulation in your mouth is the same, right? S and Z, right? Your teeth and your lips and your tongue are all basically in the same place. But now put your hand, just like touch your throat as you make those sounds. So when you make a S, right, you feel nothing. But now make a Z, Z, right? Your hands, you feel the vibration there. That's the difference between a voiced sound and an unvoiced sound, right? So the articulation is the same. The contact points in your mouth are the same, but some are voiced and some are unvoiced. And I just think these things are fun. So here we've got, again, our 23-ish letters. You know, I talked about last week how I don't really care about the number, really don't care about the number, right? If you want to count the bet and the vet as different sounds because that's useful for you, or different letters because that's useful for you as a teaching tool, you can have as many or as few letters as you wish. But the question is, why does it matter, right? Why does it matter which letters are actually individual and unique letters, right? So here I could just go back. Why does it matter? Why does Yoni keep harping on the concept that the bet and the vet are in fact the same letter, and the kaf and the chaf are the same letter, but the chaf and the chet, even though they make the same sound nowadays in my accent, aren't the same? Why is that important? And so the reason that it's important is because of these 3-letter roots. Okay, the building blocks of Hebrew words are these 3-letter roots. Now, some of you might say, well, Yoni, what about a 2-letter root like the word yad, which means hand? Yes, there are seemingly very, very primitive words that have 2 roots. There's a book that I have on my shelf called How the Hebrew Language Grew, where the author, I think it's Edward Horowitz, but either way, How the Hebrew Language Grew, he talks about how it's possible that there were early on, before the writing system, only 2-letter roots, but just like, I don't know, social security numbers and Zoom URL codes and license plates and all the, right? You run out of permutations pretty quickly. And so at some point, these 2-letter roots might have turned into 3-letter roots. And many, if not all, of the Semitic languages, so Aramaic and Arabic and Ugaritic, they have these 3, and Hebrew, they have these 3-letter roots. It seems that this was just very useful, that you could kind of get all of the meanings that you would need out of a 3-letter root. So I want to show you. So this is with Hebrew on the left, Arabic on the right, but the same 3 letters, the kaf, the tav, and the bet. And this 3-letter root, when you see these 3 letters in the proper order, although possibly with some letters, mostly vowels, in between them and before and after, right? But when you see these letters in the same word in the proper order, you know that it has to have something to do with writing, because katav, right? These 3 letters, they mean writing. So in Hebrew, if I said katav, it was he wrote, right? Katavti, I'm throwing this suffix at the end, that's I wrote. Ketiva is writing, right? Now there's the yud in between. So sometimes when I have people look at a word where I haven't color coded it, which we'll do in a moment. And I say, oh, look at here. Let me see if I can zoom in. Not successful. Okay. Let me try one more time. Let's try to zoom in. Success. Okay. Kind of success. All right. So here we have, again, I've color coded it, but when I ask people to try it without color coding, right? Sometimes they get tripped up because there's a vav in between the letters, or there's a yud in between the letters, or there's a prefix that gets them, messed up. So if you look at like this word michtavim, letters, right? Like, and not like a letter, like a otia, like a letter like that you write. Michtavim, sometimes a student, when we're talking about roots, will just take the first three letters and they'll guess, the root must be mem, kaf, tav. And I'm like, try again, right? This is a prefix, and then you have the im at the end, which is the suffix. But these are built off of these 3-letter roots, right? Katuv, written, again, you're just switching up the vowels. And remember, these vowels, right, that you see, these dots and dashes, these were invented by those Tiberian Masoretes, right? And so this is like, around 600 to 1000 CE. So the Bible wasn't written this way. This is, people just knew how to manipulate the sounds around the root as you were trying to create new meanings out of the core. And this is also true in Arabic. Now, I will say I don't read Arabic anymore. And so I didn't color code the Arabic. But also what you'll notice is that the symbols here, the letters are actually almost all the same, but their vowels, it's a different vowel system, but it's the dots above and below that are doing the work here. So you actually have basically the same looking letters, just with different vocalization signs around them, but it's the same thing, right? They have the same, these languages grew up around each other. And so, if you have kitab, that's a book. Again, just something that was written in writing. And so that's a useful thing to note. So now let's try some together. So let's start here on the right. Okay. So these are words that you probably know. All the way over here on the right, you have the word kadosh. What does kadosh mean? Someone just unmute yourself and you can share.
Holy.
Good. Kadosh is holy. What's kiddush? The second one? Kiddush.
Make kiddush, yes.
Right. So it's the name. So kadosh means holy or sanctified. And so the blessing mikadesh hashabbat, right? Again, that mem is a prefix. Mikadesh HaShabbat, who sanctifies the Sabbath. That's the name of the blessing. And so Kiddush is the name, the sanctification over the wine, over the day, right? The sanctification blessing, we call it Kiddush. The Kiddusha, also it can either mean like Kiddusha is the concept of holiness, but it's also the name of a prayer that we find where? The Kiddusha?
The Amidah.
Beautiful, right? The Amidah, right? Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh. Yep, cool. So Kedusha, you're singing the holiness of God. Kedoshim, right? That's the name of a Torah portion, right? That you will be holy to me. So Kedoshim, plural, right? So you all, the people of Israel, be holy to me, God. Lehakdish, to make holy. And here, this bottom line I threw in here, this is what you say at a wedding. Right. So this would be if a man is getting married to a woman, it's what he would say to her. So hare at mikudeshet li. Okay. You are sanctified, consecrated to me. Okay. So when you see those 3 letters in that order in a word, even if there is a prefix, a suffix, an infix, right, something in between, you know that it has to do with the concept of holiness. So here, who's a brave, let's get a brave volunteer who wants to try this middle column to bring out that 3 letters that are at the core of this.
I think it's Lamed Mem Dalet.
Perfect. Lamed, mem, daled. So talmid is a student. Lilmod is to learn. Limud is learning or instruction. Milamed, he teaches. Hatalmidim, the students. Now, this is hard, right? Because again, you've got like this double lamed here, and the lamed is like a legit letter, so maybe that's there. But in this case, it's a prefix, which means two. You've got vowels in between. So nice job, Michael. This is like the core of understanding Hebrew. And you can see how the word for a student and the word for someone who teaches, their meaning is connected, right? And it makes sense that the same word for a teacher or for someone who is teaching would also be a similar word to one who is learning. Kind of interesting. And here on the left, we have, I highlighted them, but somebody try to tell me what you think the core of this means. So the word chaver is a friend. Chevra is an organization. Choveret is like a binder, or like a notebook, something you do in school. Chevrati is social. Chavura, like we have chavurot, right? A chavura or chavurot at the temple are like these small groups. A mechaber is a composer. So what's this root of chet bet resh mean?
Being in a group.
Mm-hmm. Right? Connecting, combining, grouping, right? And so the word for a friend is very similar to the word for a composer, right? Now, someone might say, Yoni, like these words have nothing to do with each other. I'd say if you dig deep, you can find it, right? So Amy, that was perfect, right? If you really, really look, you can find it. So these words, and I want to use that as an illustrator of how diverse of a vocabulary you can build with a simple core concept. Now, this also helps us understand words that we've never seen before, because it's got something to do with grouping, connecting, combining, bringing together. So I find that to be really useful. Now here we get Yoni's soapbox. A lot of times when you say how many letters are there in the alphabet, and people say there are 22 in the Hebrew alphabet or whatever, they'll say that the shin and the sin are the same. And this is really, really tricky, right? It's tricky because, again, without the dots, which for the early half of Hebrew, the dots didn't exist, you've got the same looking symbol, two different words. Now, these are actually not, I promise you, in my opinion, these are not the same letter. And in fact, the same letters, the same looking letters in a three-letter root, one has a shin and one has a sin, don't mean the same thing, right? So again, I apologize, my parentheses got a little screwed up here as I was writing Hebrew and English in the same line, but the word on the left here with a shin, sheva, right, means 7. And from that you get, shivim, 70, a shavua is a week, so 7 days, the festival of weeks, shavuot, and shiva, right, or shiva, this 7-day mourning period after someone passes, all have to do with the number 7. Now on the right, we have the word sova, or savea. It's a sin, bet ayin, and this has nothing to do with 7, right? This is being full, right? Being if I've eaten too much, or if someone says like, Yoni, do you want more food? I'd be like, savea, right? I am satisfied. I am full. I am content, right? Sivar ratzon is a phrase used in the Bible to say that your will is satisfied. So you are content. Job, this is my favorite example of this. People are like, no, Yoni, 7, Sheva, and satisfied, Sova are connected. Okay, so here we go. This is the last line of the book of Job, of Eov, and it says, Vayamot Eov zaken u'seva yamim. He died when he was old, and Siva yamim. Okay, that doesn't mean he's 7 days, right? The word yamim means days, or like, not necessarily technically a day, but concept of time in that sense, right? Siva yamim isn't Sheva Yamim, right? He didn't die at a week old, right? He had 2 sets of 10 children. He lived this long life. This sentence would mean something very, very different, right? He was a very content infant who passed away at the end of this like epic story. No, and it doesn't mean that he was 70 years old. I think it says that he was 140 or something like that. He is satisfied, right? He's gotten his wealth back. He's gotten his family back. He dies old and satisfied. So this is, I think, the last thing that I'm going to share. This is the bonus. This is the fun thing. So every time I teach the Bible, right? And people get to the boring parts where we start talking about the tabernacle and the ritual items and students' eyes glaze over, a word pops out. When they read, let's say, the JPS translation, and it's talking about all the different coverings on top of the tabernacle, all of a sudden, a kid pops up and said, wait, there were dolphins, right? So here's what happens, right? You have this line, right? Talking about the different coverings of the tabernacle, different colored tapestries from different materials. And it says, Ve'orot techashim ve'atzei shittim, right? The problem is with this word techashim, okay, fancy word that I always think reminds me of like manamana, dun, 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 right? HAPAX legomenon, right? This means a word that only appears once in its context. And the Bible is full of them. This drives translators nuts because if you don't see the same, if you didn't know English, but every time I pointed to an older version of me and I said dad, you would over the course of time realize that the word dad means, father, whatever, right? Means dad, right? If I only say the word once, it's really hard to know. So the word techashim appears 3 times in the Bible, but in 3 seemingly different contexts. None of them give us a clue as to what it means, right? So we see it when it's talking about Tachash, this a proper name of a legendary character. So, okay, his name is Tachash. That doesn't give us anything. The second time we see it is, I think it's in the book of Exodus here, when it's talking, yes, it's Exodus. It's talking about the coverings of the tabernacle, and you've got these like red, and you have got these dyed skins and tapestries covering the tabernacle, but then you have these skins of Tachash. Okay, so question mark on what that means. And then the last one is from the book of Ezekiel, talking about a sandal made of Tachash. Okay, so the rabbis and translators struggle with this. And so you get a wide variety of translations. Some people say, because we were talking about dyed skins before, we were talking about like a crimson dye, this must be like a blue or a purple, right? So sometimes you see it translated as blue. Then people say, no, it's got to be an animal skin because you made shoes out of it. So it's got to be leather of some kind. Maybe it's a ram, maybe it's a weasel. But then they say, wait, it's the outermost layer. It must be waterproof. So it must be an aquatic animal. So now you start getting seals and dolphins and like whales and like all these beautiful things. And of course, people always say, like a Bible teacher will always say, oh, it was definitely dolphins because I went to Eilat once and I saw that there were dolphins. So they had dolphins. Okay, it's true that there are dolphins near Eilat in Egypt, but okay, are they dolphin skins? And then we get into, this is my favorite answer, which is that when we get to a word that we don't know, the rabbis go straight to like the fantastical. And they say, this must be a mythical creature that no longer exists, all right? And it's a unicorn, right? So some translations you see, they say dolphin, some say unicorn. Now, none of these are correct, but I like it. And the reason that I like it is because it's such a boring part of the Bible. Like, put the word unicorn in there, right? Put the word dolphin in. It's going to catch someone's eye. They're going to ask you a question. So what actually is it? And this is where we get into when I talked about how, Kitab and, Arabic and Hebrew share these similarities. And we talked about loan words. Okay, so the answer is not going to be as exciting as a dolphin or a unicorn, but we found archaeologically these dursu, right? These sandals that in Sumerian were called dursu. Okay, and so what is it, and why is it most likely what Tachash is that these were beaded leathers. Okay, so you would like embroider leather with ceramic beads. And we found sandals, I think in King Tut's tomb, like in ancient Egypt, we found more and more archaeological evidence that you have these beautiful leathered skins that were embroidered with ceramic beads. And then we see the word dukhsu, right? So why is that similar to the word tachash? Okay, so the D and the T sound are articulated very, very similarly to each other. And we see in certain Semitic languages that some of these letters are interchangeable because the sounds are articulated so similarly. And so dukhsu, tachash, or tachashim are this most likely the same word. This was probably a loan word from Sumerian or Akkadian, that they used to have these beautiful things. Dukhsu in Hebrew turned into tachas, right? So dukhus turned into tachas, right? And that makes some level of sense, right? We still see this if you learn numbers in Arabic, right? You hear that the t sound and the sh sound in Arabic and Hebrew can be interchangeable because, again, that t and the s are articulated very, very similarly in the mouth. And so the word for 8 in Arabic is tamnun. In Hebrew, tamnun, like shemone, right? Tamnun is an octopus, right? So the t in tamnen and sh in shemona, the t and the sh ended up just switching in these Semitic languages. So we see just these examples of that. So next week, we're going to touch on vowels. We're going to talk about syllables. We're going to talk about accents, and accents. We're going to talk about those trope marks, those cantillation marks. We're also, I forgot to put it in here, we're going to talk about letters that disappear, which make it even harder to figure out how roots work. You have these liquid letters that dissolve somehow. But then we're going to talk about, and some people get uncomfortable when I get all jazzed up about the Dagesh Chazak, but she is marvelous, okay? And we're going to talk about the Dagesh Chazak. It's a dot that was invented that is like all of the secrets of the world are in this Dagesh Chazak. And I can't tell you if there's one thing that really, really gets me going, it's a Dagesh Chazak. And people think it's really weird, but she reminds me of like Carmen Sandiego. So we're going to talk about it. We'll talk about it later. You're learning all sorts of weird things about me, but that's what we're going to do next week. We're going to talk about vowels, syllables, accents, letters that disappear, and the Dagesh Chazak, which will just unlock all of the mysteries of Hebrew, I promise. And it will help us understand why some words are just really, really difficult to figure out, right? So we're going to talk about, when we talk about vowels, talk about the word ozi, which you hear in like ozi vizimratia, right? We sing it like havdalah. There's an a vowel under it. And no one can figure out, right? The word kol, right? Kol haolam kulo, right? All. If you looked at that word and you didn't know what it was already supposed to sound like, you might think, oh, like what's that? That's an a vowel under that. It should be kal, but you know it's not, right? So we're going to talk about all of these things, words that trip us up. If you understand vowels, syllables, accents, and that alluring dagesh chazak, we're going to figure it all out together. So that'll be next week.
That's great, Yoni. You're the best.
Thank you. I don't think I undersold the Dagesh Chazak. It gets me very excited.
Okay.
I think you all like it.
There you are.
Yoni, can you send out your presentation?
Yeah, your slides.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I know. Now that I actually got the slides to work, I'll send these out along with and the video is recorded, so it will be on Facebook and on YouTube. So if you missed it or you want to go back, it'll be there for you indefinitely, or until I get so embarrassed watching my voice, listening to my voice, that I delete them. But I'll keep them up for as long as we'll just bury them with other content. It'll be great.
I need to send you my email address.
Oh, yes, please. And I'll also just send it out in our next email. I'll just send it out to everyone with all of the links in there.
Oh, okay.
Great. Well, thank you all. I would wish you a Shabbat Shalom, but we still have more good stuff happening. So at 2:30, if you were on Rabbi Kalman's challah baking class part 1, where the dough was made. Now it should be comfortably rising as you listen to me nerd out about Hebrew. And then at 2:30, she's going to get back on to finish that process. And then also this afternoon, Dan Yolis has been working so amazingly on a virtual choir, the Temple Sinai Choir. He collected beautiful recordings from everyone in the choir. He mixed them together. I don't know how long it took him. It would have taken me years to even just figure out where to start. So that is going to be released this afternoon, because this Shabbat is Shabbat Shirah, the Shabbat of song. Dan and Rabbi Kalman are leading services tonight. Rabbis Rick and Susan Rhines are leading services tomorrow. Rabbi Susan, who is a brilliant Torah reader. I hope I'm not embarrassing her by saying that publicly. She is a brilliant, perfect Torah reader. She is reading the Song of the Sea on Saturday. I don't tune into all of the services, but that one I will tune into. And then on Saturday night, there's a free concert. Or it's not a free concert, but it's free to us. It was underwritten very generously. And that is at 5:30, and then Havdalah to close out the Shabbat at 7. So I wish you a Shabbat Shalom, but also there is a lot of stuff leading up to Shabbat that I hope you enjoy.
Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you so much, Yoni.
Yeah, take care, everyone.
Thank you, Yoni.